The stone walls rise thick and gray from the Danish landscape, weathered by 8 centuries of wind carrying salt and cold off Sayre Bay. This is Dragsholm Slot, built around 1215 when bishops needed fortresses as much as churches, when power meant walls strong enough to withstand sieges and thick enough to muffle the sounds of those imprisoned within. The castle survived wars that destroyed others, survived the Reformation that transformed Denmark from Catholic to Lutheran, survived centuries as a prison holding nobles and clergymen, whose crimes were disagreeing with kings or choosing the wrong side during conflicts that shaped Danish history. Today it operates as a luxury hotel and gourmet restaurant, where guests sleep in rooms where prisoners once suffered, and where couples dine in halls, where violence occurred. But the transformation from fortress to hospitality has not erased what happened here, or silenced the stories claiming that over 100 ghosts remain wandering corridors and riding through courtyards on phantom horses. The thick walls that now provide charming historic atmosphere once prevented escape and once contained suffering that Denmark's history acknowledges, but that the castle's current incarnation does not emphasize when marketing rooms to tourists, seeking encounters with the supernatural that many visitors claim to experience when spending nights, where documented tragedy and persistent legend have become inseparable. The construction around 1215 by the Bishop of Roskilde reflected the reality that medieval bishops were political powers, requiring fortifications for protecting wealth and for projecting authority across regions where the church owned vast lands and where bishops functioned as feudal lords, exercising both spiritual and temporal power. The Bishop of Roskilde was one of Denmark's most powerful ecclesiastical figures, controlling territories and collecting revenues, and maintaining armed forces that could defend church interests and could enforce church authority when conflicts arose with secular powers or with rival bishops competing for influence and for resources in a medieval Denmark, where the lines between religious and political authority were blurred and where bishops lived in castles rather than in monasteries because their roles required them being lords as much as being clergy. The original structure was a fortified palace rather than being purely military fortress, designed to serve both defensive functions and residential functions, providing accommodations suitable for a bishop's status, and providing spaces for administering church business, and for entertaining important visitors, including kings and nobles whose support the church needed for maintaining its privileged position in Danish society. The thick stone walls that characterized Dragsholm were built to withstand attack with the castle's position, allowing control over surrounding agricultural lands and allowing surveillance of the region where the bishop's authority extended and where challenges to that authority could arise, requiring military response that fortified palaces made possible. The survival through the Count's feud from 1534 through 1536 made Dragsholm one of the few medieval castles still standing in Denmark, after conflicts that destroyed many fortifications and that transformed Denmark's political and religious landscape when the Civil War ended Catholic dominance and established Lutheran Protestantism as Denmark's state religion. The Count's feud was a succession crisis and a religious war simultaneously with Catholic and Lutheran factions, supporting different claimants to the Danish throne, and with the conflict involving not just Danish nobles, but involving outside powers including Lubeck and Sweden, who had interests in determining who would control Denmark and what religious orientation the Danish crown would adopt. Before we continue, subscribe for more stories from Europe's oldest castles, where documented history and persistent legend merge into something that neither proves nor disproves what people claim to experience in places that have witnessed centuries of power and suffering and death. The castle's survival through the war that destroyed others was partly good fortune and partly strategic importance, with Dragsholm being valuable enough to preserve rather than to destroy, and being strong enough to withstand sieges that might have damaged lesser fortifications. The transition to crown property in 1536, after the Reformation, followed the pattern throughout Denmark and throughout Protestant Europe, where church properties were seized by secular authorities who claimed the wealth and the lands that the Catholic Church had accumulated over centuries, creating windfalls that strengthened monarchies and that eliminated the church as an independent power center that could challenge royal authority. The transformation into a Baroque-style residence during the 17th century reflected changing military technology, making medieval fortifications obsolete, and reflected changing tastes among Danish nobility, who wanted comfortable, elegant homes rather than wanting cold, defensive structures that had been necessary during earlier periods when warfare was constant and when strong walls meant survival. The Baroque modifications added windows and added decorative elements and modified interiors, creating spaces that were more livable and more fashionable than the austere medieval structure had provided. Though the modifications worked within the constraints of the existing thick walls, that could not be removed completely and that remained as foundations and as defining features, creating a Baroque residence that retained its fortress character beneath the architectural embellishments that 17th century taste demanded. The windows that were added during the Baroque renovation were larger and more numerous than the narrow defensive slits that medieval military architecture had required, allowing natural light to flood rooms that had previously been dark and gloomy, creating interiors that were brighter and more pleasant for daily living than the fortress had ever been when function dictated form, and when comfort was secondary to defense. The decorative elements included ornamental plasterwork on ceilings, carved wooden details on doors and staircases, and painted surfaces that replaced bare stone, creating visual richness that communicated wealth and sophistication that Baroque aesthetics valued, and that medieval austerity had rejected as unnecessary luxury that distracted from serious purposes of defense and control. The interior modifications reconfigured room layouts where possible, creating enfilades of connected chambers that allowed for formal processions and social gatherings that Baroque court culture required, with rooms flowing into one another in sequences that facilitated entertaining and that displayed the owner's taste and resources through carefully orchestrated spatial experiences that medieval fortresses had never been designed to provide. The more livable spaces reflected recognition that castles no longer needed to function primarily as military installations, and could instead function as country estates where noble families lived year-round or seasonally, enjoying rural settings and agricultural revenues without constantly preparing for sieges or maintaining military readiness that earlier centuries had required when Danish politics were more violent and when noble families needed fortifications for surviving conflicts that could erupt unpredictably. The fashionable character that Baroque modifications created aligned Dragsholm with European architectural trends that were transforming castles and palaces across the continent, with French influence being particularly strong during the 17th century, when Louis XIV's Versailles set standards for elegance and grandeur that nobles throughout Europe attempted to emulate within their means and within the constraints of existing structures that could not be rebuilt entirely, but that could be updated to reflect contemporary taste. The constraints imposed by the existing thick walls meant that Baroque renovators worked within medieval footprints rather than creating entirely new structures, leading to hybrid buildings that combined old and new in ways that created distinctive characters different from purpose-built Baroque palaces that could be designed from foundations up without accommodating pre-existing military architecture. The thick walls that remained provided excellent insulation and provided structural strength that allowed adding upper floors or adding roof structures without concerns about foundations being inadequate, creating practical advantages that offset the design limitations that working within medieval constraints imposed on architects who would have preferred starting fresh but who made Baroque modifications work within what existed. The foundations that the medieval structure provided were solid and deep, having been built to support defensive towers and to withstand siege engines, and to remain stable even when undermined by attackers digging tunnels, creating structural capacity that Baroque renovations could exploit for creating larger rooms or taller ceilings than would have been possible if foundations had been designed only for lighter medieval buildings. The defining features that the fortress character contributed included the overall massing and proportions of the building that remained medieval, despite Baroque details being applied to surfaces, with Dragsholm retaining its castle silhouette and retaining its commanding presence in the landscape, rather than being transformed into something that looked like a purpose-built Baroque palace that would have had different proportions and different relationships to surrounding grounds. The architectural embellishments that 17th century taste demanded included formal gardens replacing medieval courtyards, with Baroque landscape design creating geometric patterns and creating vistas that extended visual control over surrounding lands in ways that expressed power through aesthetics rather than through military might, that medieval fortifications had expressed through their ability to dominate territory through force. The staircases that were added or modified during Baroque renovations were grand and ceremonial, rather than being purely functional, as medieval stairs had been, with Baroque staircases serving as architectural features that impressed visitors and that provided settings for formal entrances and exits that social rituals required when receiving guests or when displaying status through controlled movement through carefully designed spaces. The heating systems were improved during renovations, with more fireplaces being added and with flues being designed more efficiently, creating warmer interiors that made winter occupation more comfortable than medieval arrangements had allowed when heating had been rudimentary and when keeping warm had required layers of clothing and had required accepting that rooms would be cold, despite fires burning in hearths that were inadequate for heating the volumes that thick stone walls enclosed. The costs of Baroque renovations were substantial, requiring investment that demonstrated the owner's wealth and demonstrated their commitment to maintaining Dragsholm as a prestigious residence rather than allowing it to decline or to remain a purely functional structure. Without the architectural refinements that status required during periods when appearance mattered enormously for maintaining social position and for impressing peers who judged families partly through the quality and fashionability of their estates. The craftsmen who executed Baroque modifications would have included masons for stonework, carpenters for woodwork, plasterers for decorative ceiling work, painters for painted decoration, glaziers for the new windows, and various other specialized workers whose skills created the details that transformed medieval austerity into Baroque elegance through labor that was expensive and that required time and coordination that substantial construction projects always demand. The Danish Baroque style had distinctive characteristics that differed from French or Italian Baroque, with Danish examples being somewhat more restrained and being adapted to northern climates that required different considerations for weatherproofing and for insulation than southern Baroque architecture needed, creating regional variations that reflected both aesthetic preferences and practical necessities that climate and available materials imposed. The integration of Baroque elements with medieval structures created architectural palimpsests where different eras remained visible and remained legible to observers who understood enough about architectural history to recognize which features dated to original construction and which features dated to later modifications, creating buildings that told stories about changing times and changing priorities through their physical fabric. The 17th century owners who commissioned Baroque renovations were making statements about their modernity and about their participation in European cultural trends, distinguishing themselves from more conservative nobles who might have maintained medieval arrangements either from preference or from inability to afford updates that required substantial capital and required willingness to disrupt household operations during construction periods. The construction periods for major renovations could last years, with families either living elsewhere during work or living in portions of the castle that were not actively under construction, creating inconveniences that had to be weighed against the benefits of having a more fashionable and more comfortable residence that renovations would produce once completed. The medieval chapel that had been part of the original bishop's fortress was likely retained during Baroque renovations, though possibly modified to reflect Protestant worship practices that differed from Catholic rituals that the chapel had originally served, with changes potentially including removing Catholic imagery and altar arrangements and creating simpler interiors that Lutheran theology preferred for focusing attention on preaching rather than on elaborate ceremonies. The servants' quarters were probably reorganized during renovations, with Baroque household management requiring different staff arrangements and different spatial relationships between family areas and service areas than medieval households had required, creating zones within the castle that reflected social hierarchies and that facilitated the complex domestic operations that aristocratic households required for functioning smoothly. The kitchens would have been updated with Baroque renovations, likely improving cooking facilities and improving storage and improving the systems for moving food from kitchens to dining rooms, though the separation between cooking areas and eating areas would have remained substantial because fire risks and cooking smells made locating kitchens away from main living spaces prudent, regardless of architectural style or period. The wine cellars and storage vaults that medieval construction had created in basements and in foundations would have continued being used during Baroque period and beyond, with the cool, dry conditions that thick walls and below-ground locations provided being ideal for storing wine and storing foodstuffs that required protection from heat and from moisture that could cause spoilage. The transition from fortress to residence was not absolute, with Dragsholm retaining some defensive capabilities and retaining its capacity to be secured if necessary. Though by the 17th century, the likelihood of the castle needing to withstand attack had diminished enough that comfort could take precedence over defense in ways that would have been unthinkable during earlier periods when threats were constant and when compromising defensive capabilities for aesthetic improvements would have been considered dangerously irresponsible. The symbolic importance of owning a castle remained even after military functions became obsolete, with castles conferring prestige and conferring legitimacy that newer buildings could not provide, regardless of how elegant or fashionable those newer buildings might be, creating incentives for maintaining and updating existing castles rather than abandoning them for purpose-built Baroque palaces that would have lacked the historical associations and the symbolic weight that ancient fortresses carried. The Baroque period modifications at Dragsholm represented a moment when the building's identity shifted from being primarily a fortress and prison to being primarily a noble residence, though the prison functions continued for some time after renovations were complete, with dungeons remaining available for holding prisoners, even while upper floors were being transformed into elegant living spaces, creating stark contrast between the refined Baroque interiors where the noble family lived and the harsh medieval dungeons below, where prisoners suffered in conditions that Baroque renovations did nothing to improve. The preservation of medieval elements within Baroque renovations means that visitors to Dragsholm today can see evidence of both periods, understanding how the castle evolved and understanding how different centuries left their marks on the structure, creating the complex layered building that exists now with medieval foundations and walls, supporting Baroque windows and decorative elements that together create an architectural history that can be read by those who know what to look for and who understand enough about Danish architectural development to interpret what they observe. The aesthetic that Baroque renovations created at Dragsholm influenced how the castle was perceived by contemporaries, and influenced how it was perceived by later generations, who inherited a building that was neither purely medieval nor purely Baroque, but was instead a hybrid, reflecting multiple periods and multiple purposes, creating complexity that makes Dragsholm more interesting architecturally than it would be if it were a pristine example of a single style, built during a single period without the modifications and adaptations that centuries of use inevitably produce when buildings remain occupied and remain functioning rather than being preserved as frozen monuments to single moments in architectural history. The craftsmanship that Baroque artisans brought to Dragsholm represented high levels of skill and represented aesthetic sensibilities that valued ornamentation and valued visual harmony and valued the creation of spaces that pleased the eye and that created emotional responses through carefully controlled proportions and through carefully executed details that communicated care and communicated wealth, and communicated the owner's refined taste that Baroque culture considered essential for anyone claiming high social status. The materials used in Baroque renovations included imported elements when local materials were inadequate for achieving desired effects, with certain stones or certain woods or certain decorative elements being brought from elsewhere in Denmark or from other countries, when creating the level of finish and the level of elegance that Baroque standards required for prestigious residences, that would be judged by visitors who understood quality and who would notice shortcuts or inferior materials that compromised the overall effect. The lighting that Baroque interiors required was achieved through the larger windows that renovations added, and was achieved through increased use of mirrors that reflected available light multiplying its effects, with candles and oil lamps providing artificial illumination during evening hours, when social activities continued and when the Baroque preference for elaborate entertaining required spaces that could be used comfortably after dark when natural light was unavailable. The acoustic properties of Baroque spaces differed from medieval spaces, with Baroque designers creating rooms that were suitable for music and for conversation, with ceiling heights and surface treatments being chosen partly for how they affected sound-creating environments where chamber music could be performed or where social conversation could occur without the echoing and the harsh acoustics that bare stone medieval rooms created. The furnishings that filled Baroque interiors at Dragsholm would have included pieces that were fashionable during the 17th century, with upholstered chairs and elaborate beds and display cabinets and other furniture types that Baroque living required, replacing or supplementing medieval furnishings that had been simpler and that had been more purely functional without the decorative emphasis that Baroque furniture brought to interiors, where appearance mattered as much as utility. The use as a prison for nobles and political enemies during the 16th and 17th centuries made Dragsholm notorious and made it a place that Danish elites feared when political fortunes turned and when royal displeasure could mean imprisonment in conditions that were harsh and that could last for years, or could end only with death in dungeons that were designed more for punishment than for humane confinement. The prisoners held at Dragsholm were not common criminals, but were people of rank whose offenses were political or religious, whose continued freedom threatened royal authority or threatened religious uniformity that the Protestant Danish state demanded from subjects who were expected to conform to Lutheranism and who were expected to support the crown without question or without supporting factions that opposed royal policies. The most famous prisoner was James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell, who had been the 3rd husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, and who had been implicated in the murder of Mary's 2nd husband, Lord Darnley, creating a scandal that contributed to Mary's downfall. And that led to Bothwell fleeing Scotland and eventually being captured by Danish authorities who imprisoned him at Dragsholm, where he would spend his final years. Bothwell's imprisonment at Dragsholm began in 1573 after he had been seized by authorities in Norway, which was then under Danish control, with Bothwell being recognized as a fugitive and being someone whose imprisonment would please Elizabeth I of England, who viewed Mary as a threat and who viewed Bothwell as Mary's accomplice in crimes that had shocked Europe and that had demonstrated that even queens could be brought down through scandals involving murder and inappropriate marriages to men suspected of committing those murders. The conditions of Bothwell's imprisonment were brutal, with accounts describing him being chained in dungeons, where he could not stand upright, and where he was denied basic comforts, and where his health deteriorated over the years. He spent imprisoned without trial and without hope of release, because his imprisonment served Danish diplomatic interests that required keeping him confined regardless of whether he had committed crimes against Denmark. The duration of Bothwell's imprisonment lasted from 1573 until his death in 1578, with 5 years being spent in conditions that destroyed his physical health and his mental health, according to accounts that describe him becoming insane, or at least becoming severely disturbed through the isolation and through the treatment that imprisonment imposed on a man who had been powerful and who had been at the center of royal courts, but who ended his life in a dungeon far from Scotland and far from the power struggles that had defined his career and that had brought him to disgrace. The death of Bothwell at Dragsholm occurred under circumstances that were documented, but that left questions about whether he died from illness or from the effects of imprisonment itself, with his body being mummified either deliberately or through natural processes related to the conditions in the dungeon where he died, and where his remains were kept for some time before being moved and before eventually being lost or destroyed, leaving no physical evidence of where Bothwell's final resting place might be, beyond the general knowledge that he died at Dragsholm, and that his body had been at the castle for some period after his death. The legends claiming that Bothwell still haunts the castle emerged sometime after his death, with stories about a spectral figure riding through the courtyard on horseback being attributed to Bothwell's spirit replaying his arrival, or replaying rides he took before his imprisonment, or simply manifesting in the form of a mounted rider, because that image captures something essential about Bothwell as a noble and as a military figure whose identity was connected to horses and to the privileges that rank had afforded him before his fall. The documentation of Bothwell's death includes records showing that he died in 1578 after 5 years of imprisonment, but the specific medical cause of death was not recorded with precision that would allow modern assessment of whether particular illnesses killed him or whether the general effects of prolonged confinement in harsh conditions without adequate food or medical care or basic hygiene slowly destroyed his health until his body could no longer sustain life. The illness that may have killed Bothwell could have been any of numerous diseases that afflicted prisoners in early modern dungeons where sanitation was non-existent and where exposure to cold and damp created conditions ideal for respiratory infections and for other ailments that would progress unchecked when medical attention was denied or was inadequate for treating serious conditions that required interventions beyond what prison keepers were willing or able to provide. The effects of imprisonment that contributed to or caused Bothwell's death included the physical trauma of being chained in positions that prevented normal movement, the psychological trauma of isolation and of hopelessness when years passed without any prospect of release or trial or contact with the outside world, beyond his jailers, who treated him not as a former earl, but as a dangerous prisoner whose suffering was either irrelevant or was intentional punishment for his alleged crimes. The mummification of Bothwell's body has been attributed to the dry conditions in certain parts of Dragsholm's dungeons, where air circulation and low humidity could have preserved tissues rather than allowing normal decomposition, creating natural mummification that occurred without deliberate embalming, when bodies were left in environments that happened to have characteristics that prevented bacterial activity and that desiccated flesh, creating preserved remains that could last for extended periods. The deliberate mummification theory suggests that Danish authorities or castle staff intentionally preserved Bothwell's body either as a curiosity or as evidence, or for reasons that are unclear when normal practice would have been burial shortly after death, rather than preservation that required effort and that required methods that would not have been standard for handling prisoners' remains. The dungeon conditions that could have created natural mummification would have included cool temperatures, low moisture, and possibly high salt content in the air coming from the nearby sea, creating an environment that resembled natural mummification conditions found in desert climates or in certain caves where bodies have been preserved accidentally through environmental factors rather than through human intervention. The keeping of Bothwell's remains for some time after his death before moving them suggests that authorities were uncertain what to do with the body of a man who had been important enough to be husband to a queen, but who had died as a prisoner without rank or status, that would normally determine burial procedures and burial locations for people of his former standing. The movement of the body from its initial location to other locations within Denmark or possibly outside Denmark remains poorly documented, with records either not existing or not surviving into the modern period, when historians became interested in tracing Bothwell's final disposition and in locating his remains if they still existed somewhere in burial that had been forgotten or in storage that had been overlooked. The eventual loss or destruction of Bothwell's remains means that physical evidence that could confirm details about his imprisonment and about his death, and about whether mummification occurred, and about what caused it, has been eliminated, leaving only written accounts that are incomplete and that are sometimes contradictory when describing what happened to Bothwell's body after his death at Dragsholm. The lack of physical evidence regarding Bothwell's final resting place creates mysteries that have never been solved, despite occasional claims that remains have been found, or that burial locations have been identified, with these claims typically being unverified or being dismissed by serious historians who find the evidence insufficient for establishing that any particular remains are actually Bothwell's or that any particular location actually contains his grave. The general knowledge that Bothwell died at Dragsholm is well established through contemporary documents that recorded his imprisonment and that recorded his death, making this one of the few certainties in a story that is otherwise filled with gaps and uncertainties about details that were not considered important enough to document carefully when Bothwell died, or that were documented but were subsequently lost when records were destroyed or misplaced over centuries. The period after Bothwell's death, when his body remained at the castle before being moved, could have lasted weeks or months or even years, depending on what decisions were being made about disposition, and depending on whether preservation was occurring naturally or deliberately, making it unnecessary to bury the body immediately, as would normally have been required to prevent decomposition and the sanitary problems that decomposing bodies create. The emergence of legends about Bothwell's ghost sometime after his death reflects the pattern common to many haunted locations, where famous or notorious people who died become subjects of ghost stories, regardless of whether any evidence suggests that their spirits actually remain, with the fame or the notoriety making these individuals memorable and making their association with particular locations create opportunities for ghost stories that capitalize on existing knowledge and existing interest in the historical figures. The timing of when Bothwell ghost stories first appeared is unclear, with no documentation establishing whether stories circulated immediately after his death or whether they emerged decades or centuries later when Dragsholm's reputation as a haunted castle was developing, and when famous historical prisoners, including Bothwell, became convenient subjects for ghost legends that enhanced the castle's mystique and that created narratives connecting past tragedies to present experiences. The spectral figure riding through the courtyard has been described in various accounts, with details varying about what the figure looks like and what the horse looks like and what time of day or night the apparition appears, creating inconsistencies that suggest either that different witnesses are seeing different things or that the legend has evolved over time, with different versions emphasizing different details, depending on who is telling the story and what purposes the story serves. The attribution of the mounted rider to Bothwell's spirit, rather than to other possible ghosts or to natural phenomena that could create impressions of movement, reflects the power of Bothwell's story and reflects how his fame as Mary, Queen of Scots' husband, makes him a more compelling ghost than anonymous prisoners who also died at Dragsholm, but whose stories are unknown and whose ghosts would not attract the same interest or the same belief from visitors who come to the castle hoping to encounter famous spirits rather than encountering generic hauntings. The replaying of his arrival or of rides before imprisonment suggests a ghost trapped in loops, repeating moments from life, which is a common motif in ghost lore, where spirits allegedly reenact significant events without awareness of the present and without ability to escape the patterns that death has locked them into, creating eternal repetitions that observers can witness when conditions are right or when the ghost chooses to manifest. The manifestation in the form of a mounted rider captures Bothwell's identity as a nobleman and as a military figure whose power and whose status were expressed through horsemanship and through the ability to ride and to lead cavalry, and to display martial prowess that were expected from men of his rank during the 16th century when warfare involved cavalry charges and when nobles were expected to be accomplished riders. The connection between Bothwell's identity and horses makes the phantom rider image psychologically and culturally appropriate for representing his ghost in ways that other images would not be. With the choice of a mounted figure rather than a figure on foot or a figure appearing in a dungeon, reflecting what makes Bothwell distinctive and what makes his ghost story memorable, rather than being one of many generic prisoner ghosts that Dragsholm could claim without the specificity that famous historical figures provide. The privileges that rank had afforded Bothwell before his fall included the right to own horses, and to ride and to hunt, and to participate in tournaments, and to lead men in battle, creating a life that was active and public and powerful, in stark contrast to the imprisonment that ended that life, and that reduced him from earl to prisoner, and from someone who rode horses to someone who was chained in dungeons, unable to move freely, or to exercise the privileges that his birth and his marriages had temporarily provided. The fall from power that Bothwell experienced was dramatic and total, with his imprisonment at Dragsholm representing the nadir of a descent that had begun with accusations of murder and had continued through flight from Scotland and through the collapse of Mary's reign, and through his capture and through his transfer to Danish custody, where he would spend his final years, without hope and without the comforts or the dignities that his former rank would have entitled him to if he had not been accused of crimes and if he had not become a political liability that no one wanted to release or to support. The essential quality that the Phantom Rider image captures is the contradiction between what Bothwell had been and what he became, with the ghost on horseback representing the Earl and the military commander, while the historical reality of his death in chains represents the prisoner and the broken man who died, far from Scotland and far from power, creating a tension that makes the legend poignant and makes it psychologically complex, rather than being simply a scary story about a ghost that rides through courtyards without meaning or without connection to the actual life and the actual suffering that the historical Bothwell experienced. The witnesses who claim to see or hear the Phantom Rider report various details, with some describing seeing a full apparition of horse and rider, while others describe only hearing hoofbeats or sensing a presence without seeing anything visual, creating a range of reported experiences that believers interpret as the ghost manifesting with varying levels of intensity, while skeptics interpret as different people experiencing different things and attributing them all to the same legend because the legend provides a convenient explanation. The courtyard where the rider allegedly appears would have been the entry point to the castle, and would have been where Bothwell arrived when first brought to Dragsholm as a prisoner, making this location psychologically significant if the ghost story is understood as being about Bothwell's spirit being trapped at the moment of arrival, when his imprisonment began, and when his final fate was sealed by walls and by chains that he would never escape except through death, that apparently did not release him if the legends about his ghost are believed. The other prisoners who were held at Dragsholm included various nobles and clergy who had opposed the crown, or who had supported Catholic causes, or who had simply been on the wrong side of political conflicts that characterized Denmark during the religious and political upheavals of the 16th and 17th centuries. The specific names and the specific fates of many of these prisoners are not well documented, with records being incomplete or being lost over centuries, leaving gaps where historians cannot establish who was imprisoned when or what happened to them, beyond general knowledge that Dragsholm functioned as a state prison for people whose offenses were considered serious enough to warrant confinement in a royal fortress, rather than in ordinary jails that held common criminals. The traitors who were imprisoned at Dragsholm had committed or were accused of committing crimes against the Danish state, including plotting against the king, supporting foreign powers, or participating in rebellions that threatened royal authority and that required harsh responses, demonstrating that treason would be punished severely and that loyalty to the crown was not optional for subjects who wanted to avoid imprisonment or execution. The clergy who were imprisoned typically had refused to accept the Reformation, or had continued practicing Catholic rites, or had opposed Lutheran doctrine in ways that the Danish state considered threatening to religious uniformity that Protestant authorities enforced rigorously during periods when religious dissent was viewed as political disloyalty and when maintaining religious conformity was considered essential for maintaining social order and maintaining royal authority over a population that had been Catholic for centuries before the Reformation forced conversion to Protestantism. The reputation as Denmark's most haunted castle emerged over centuries, with the claims of over 100 ghosts being a number that appears in tourism literature and in paranormal sources, but that cannot be verified through any systematic census or through any historical documentation establishing when this specific number was first cited or what basis exists for claiming such a precise count of spirits allegedly inhabiting Dragsholm. The number is almost certainly an exaggeration or is a marketing claim, rather than being a figure derived from actual investigations or from actual counts of reported apparitions. But the claim serves the purpose of establishing Dragsholm as being extraordinarily haunted, rather than being merely haunted in ways that many old castles are rumored to be, when centuries of occupation inevitably produce deaths and produce stories about those deaths persisting through ghost tales. The White Lady is said to be a noblewoman who was imprisoned by her father after a forbidden love affair, with the legend claiming that she fell in love with a commoner or with someone socially inappropriate, and that her father punished her through imprisonment at Dragsholm, where she died either from illness or from the conditions of confinement or from despair when hope of escape or hope of reunion with her lover faded. The ghost of the White Lady is said to wander corridors dressed in white, with witnesses claiming to see her walking through the castle at night, or appearing in windows or manifesting in ways that create impressions of a sad figure, endlessly searching or endlessly mourning for the life she lost and for the love she was prevented from pursuing when her father's authority and social conventions about appropriate marriages destroyed her chances for happiness and ultimately destroyed her life. The historical basis for the White Lady legend is unclear, with no specific documented case of a noblewoman being imprisoned at Dragsholm by her father for having a forbidden love affair, though such events were not uncommon in European noble families, where daughters were expected to marry according to family interests rather than according to personal preferences, and where defiance could result in harsh punishment, including imprisonment, or being sent to convents, where disobedient daughters could be confined without the scandal that more public punishments would create. The legend may be based on an actual case that has been forgotten, or may be a composite of multiple stories, or may be entirely invented as a romantic tragedy that serves narrative purposes without being grounded in any specific historical event that can be verified through documents or through reliable accounts contemporary to when the event supposedly occurred. The sightings of the White Lady that visitors and staff report include seeing a figure in white appearing briefly before disappearing, hearing sounds of crying or hearing footsteps in corridors where no one should be present, and experiencing feelings of sadness or experiencing cold spots in locations associated with the White Lady legend. The reports have accumulated over time, with each generation adding accounts that reinforce the legend and that create patterns, suggesting consistency. Though skeptics note that knowing the legend creates expectations that shape perceptions, and that make visitors more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as confirming the existence of the White Lady when those same stimuli would be ignored or would be interpreted differently if experienced in locations without established ghost stories. The Grey Lady is believed to be a servant who died of illness, with the legend describing her as being a more benevolent presence than the White Lady, with the Grey Lady allegedly helping guests by performing small tasks, including tidying rooms or moving objects, in ways that create impressions that someone has been caring for the space, even when no living person has been present. The helpful ghost motif appears in folklore from various cultures, with stories about domestic spirits or about ghosts of servants continuing their duties after death, being common enough that the Grey Lady legend fits recognizable patterns rather than being unique to Dragsholm or being original to the castle's specific history. The evidence for the Grey Lady legend being based on a specific historical servant is non-existent, with no records identifying who this servant might have been, or when she might have died, or what illness caused her death, leaving the legend as a story without historical foundation that serves purposes within the castle's ghost lore, without necessarily corresponding to any actual person whose life and death created the basis for the tales that have been told about the Grey Lady over however many years or decades. The legend has been circulating among staff and among visitors who have stayed at Dragsholm. The reports of the Grey Lady's activities include finding belongings moved or finding rooms tidied when no staff should have been present, though these reports are difficult to verify and are susceptible to natural explanations, including staff performing duties without guests being aware, or including guests misremembering where they placed items, or including coincidences being interpreted as paranormal when they are actually unremarkable events that happen regularly in any hotel where staff and guests interact in ways that are not always transparent or obvious. The Earl of Bothwell's spirit is said to ride through the courtyard, replaying his tragic fate, with witnesses claiming to hear hoofbeats or claiming to see a mounted figure appearing briefly before vanishing, creating an impression that Bothwell continues to haunt the location where he spent his final years imprisoned and where he died far from the power and the glory that his earlier life had provided when he was influential and when he was Mary, Queen of Scots' husband, during the brief period before scandal and accusations destroyed both their positions and forced them into exile and imprisonment. The courtyard riding motif fits Bothwell's identity as a nobleman and as someone whose life involved horses and military activities, making the image of a phantom rider appropriate for representing his spirit. If one accepts that spirits can manifest and can create perceptions that living observers experience as seeing or hearing presences that should not be there. The timing of the alleged sightings varies, with some witnesses reporting phenomena occurring at night, while others claim experiences during twilight or even during daylight hours, creating inconsistencies that either suggest the ghost appears on its own schedule without regard for when ghost stories typically claim spirits manifest, or suggest that different witnesses are interpreting different stimuli through the lens of the Bothwell legend, attributing whatever they experience to his ghost, because they know the story and because the courtyard is where the legend places him. The frequency of reports has apparently increased over time, as Dragsholm's reputation as a haunted castle has grown, and as more visitors come specifically seeking paranormal experiences, raising questions about whether more people are actually encountering Bothwell's ghost, or whether more people are experiencing normal events and interpreting them as paranormal, because expectations and suggestion create perceptual frameworks that make ambiguous stimuli seem meaningful and seem supernatural. The emotional tone that witnesses attribute to the phantom rider varies, with some describing the apparition as menacing or disturbing, while others describe it as sad or melancholic, reflecting perhaps the different aspects of Bothwell's story, where he was both dangerous and pitiable, both a man accused of murder and a man who suffered greatly during imprisonment that destroyed him physically and mentally, before death finally released him from conditions that no human should have endured, regardless of what crimes they may or may not have committed. The persistence of the Bothwell legend, specifically rather than generic phantom rider stories, reflects how historical knowledge shapes ghost lore, with famous figures becoming identified with locations where they suffered or died, creating named ghosts that are more compelling and more marketable than anonymous spirits would be, when tourism depends partly on offering visitors chances to encounter ghosts, whose identities connect to recognizable historical narratives that give meaning to alleged supernatural experiences beyond just the thrill of encountering something unexplained. The guests and staff who report footsteps, voices, and apparitions throughout the castle create a body of testimony that paranormal enthusiasts cite as evidence that Dragsholm is genuinely haunted, while skeptics note that old buildings create sounds through settling and through wind, and through countless normal processes that can seem mysterious when heard in darkness or when heard in contexts where ghost stories have created expectations that make every sound potentially significant and potentially supernatural. The voices that people report hearing are typically described as being indistinct or as being conversational sounds that stop when listeners attempt to locate sources, or when listeners approach areas where sounds seem to originate, creating patterns consistent with either genuine paranormal phenomena or consistent with sound, traveling through the castle's complex architecture in ways that create acoustic effects that seem anomalous, but that have natural explanations involving how old stone buildings transmit and distort sounds. The apparitions that are reported include full-figure sightings of people in period clothing, appearing in corridors or in rooms or looking out windows, with descriptions varying enough that identifying which specific ghost is being seen becomes difficult or impossible without the witnesses being familiar with the legends and without the witnesses assigning their experiences to the White Lady or to the Gray Lady or to other specific spirits based on appearance or based on location within the castle where particular ghosts are said to appear most frequently. The variety of reported apparitions and the frequency of reports from both guests and staff create impressions that something unusual occurs at Dragsholm, though establishing what that something is proves difficult when testimony is subjective and when corroboration is limited, and when explanations involving suggestion and misperception and the effects of spending time in a location with an established haunted reputation remain plausible alternatives to accepting that ghosts genuinely appear to living observers in ways that can be perceived visually or auditorily. The recognition as one of Denmark's most important historical landmarks reflects Dragsholm's architectural significance and reflects its survival as one of the few medieval castles remaining in a country where wars and modernization destroyed many similar structures, leaving Dragsholm as a valuable example of medieval Danish fortification architecture that has been modified over centuries, but that retains essential features allowing historians and visitors to understand what such castles were like when they served their original purposes as fortified palaces and as prisons, rather than serving current purposes as hotels and restaurants. The historical importance extends beyond architecture to include Dragsholm's role in Danish political and religious history, with the castle being connected to major events, including the Reformation and the religious conflicts that transformed Denmark, and with the castle having held prisoners, whose stories intersect with broader European history, including Bothwell, whose connection to Mary, Queen of Scots, makes him a figure of interest beyond just Danish history. The haunted reputation has made Dragsholm a popular tourist destination, attracting visitors who are interested in ghosts and who are interested in paranormal investigation and who are willing to pay premium prices for staying overnight in a castle that markets itself as being among Europe's most haunted locations. The ghost hunters who visit Dragsholm bring equipment including electromagnetic field detectors and digital recorders and infrared cameras, attempting to document phenomena that they believe occur in the castle, with some investigators claiming to have captured evidence, while others leave frustrated that their visits produced nothing unusual despite spending hours or overnight periods in locations where ghost activity is supposedly common. The history enthusiasts who visit are drawn by Dragsholm's age and by its connection to significant historical events and figures, with some being interested in the ghost stories, while others are more focused on the castle's architectural features and its documented history, rather than on the paranormal claims that have become central to how Dragsholm markets itself to contemporary tourists. The blending of luxury hospitality with paranormal tourism creates a unique position among European castles, with Dragsholm offering both fine dining and comfortable accommodations, while simultaneously encouraging guests to believe that they might encounter ghosts during their stays. The restaurant at Dragsholm has earned recognition for its cuisine, creating a situation where some visitors come primarily for the dining experience and view the ghost stories as interesting background rather than as the primary attraction, while other visitors come specifically hoping to experience paranormal phenomena and view the luxury accommodations and the gourmet food as pleasant amenities accompanying their ghost hunting or their desire to sleep in a genuinely haunted location, rather than in places that merely claim to be haunted without having the centuries of history and the documented use as a prison that makes Dragsholm's haunted reputation more substantial than what modern haunted houses, constructed specifically for entertainment, can provide. The skepticism about the ghost stories remains substantial among people who view paranormal claims as being products of suggestion and misperception, rather than being evidence of spirits genuinely persisting after death and genuinely interacting with the living. The skeptical arguments note that old buildings produce sounds and produce visual effects that can seem mysterious, but that have conventional explanations. That people who visit locations expecting to encounter ghosts are primed to interpret ambiguous experiences as paranormal. That tourism businesses have financial incentives for promoting ghost stories regardless of whether those stories have any basis in fact, and that the consistency of reports across different witnesses can be explained through shared cultural knowledge about what ghosts are supposed to do and where they are supposed to appear, creating a situation where people report what they expect to experience, rather than reporting what they actually perceive objectively, without those expectations influencing interpretation. The ghost stories remaining central to Dragsholm's identity, despite skepticism, demonstrates that commercial and cultural factors make ghost stories valuable, regardless of whether those stories are true. With the castle benefiting from its haunted reputation, through increased tourism and through media attention that keeps Dragsholm in public awareness, when hundreds of other Danish castles receive less attention because they lack the ghost stories and the dramatic legends that make Dragsholm distinctive, and that make it memorable for visitors who might forget other castles they toured, but who remember the one that claimed to have over 100 ghosts, and that claimed to be haunted by Mary, Queen of Scots' husband, who died in the dungeons after years of imprisonment. The cultural impact extends beyond tourism, to include Dragsholm, appearing in books and documentaries about haunted locations and about European castle history, with the ghost stories being repeated in paranormal literature and being repeated in travel guides, creating a situation where the legends become increasingly established through repetition, even when that repetition does not constitute evidence that the legends are accurate or that the ghosts genuinely exist beyond being stories that people tell and that people want to believe, because belief makes visiting the castle more exciting than visiting would be if the castle were presented purely as a historical site without the paranormal elements that transform touring from an educational experience into an adventure-seeking encounters with the supernatural. The Danish perspective on Dragsholm and its ghosts reflects broader Danish attitudes about folklore and history, with Danes generally being practical and skeptical, but also being willing to acknowledge cultural heritage that includes ghost stories passed down through generations, even when those stories are not literally believed by everyone who repeats them. The castle's operation as a luxury hotel requires balancing the ghost stories that attract certain tourists against the reality that many guests simply want comfortable accommodations and good food without being disturbed by ghost hunters or by paranormal claims that might make some visitors uncomfortable rather than excited about staying in a location that markets itself as being haunted. The preservation of Dragsholm as a functioning castle rather than as a ruin or as a museum creates opportunities for experiencing the space in ways that bring history alive, more effectively than cordoned-off museum rooms can achieve, when visitors can only look but cannot touch, or cannot stay overnight experiencing what it might have been like to live in a medieval castle, even if modern amenities and modern safety standards mean that the experience is dramatically different from what actual medieval residents or prisoners would have experienced when the castle was fortress and prison rather than hotel. The ongoing use of the castle means that preservation work continues with the owners, maintaining the structure and making necessary repairs and updates that keep the building sound, while attempting to preserve historical character that makes Dragsholm valuable and attractive to visitors seeking authentic historical environments rather than seeking modern recreations or theme park versions of medieval castles. The question of whether Dragsholm is genuinely haunted or whether the ghost stories are simply folklore and marketing cannot be answered definitively, with the evidence being insufficient for proving that spirits exist and haunt the castle, but being sufficient for establishing that many people across many years have reported experiences that they interpret as paranormal and that they attribute to ghosts that they believe inhabit Dragsholm, creating a situation where belief is well documented. Even if the objective reality of what people believe in remains unproven and remains disputed by skeptics who offer alternative explanations for every reported phenomenon without being able to definitively prove that their explanations are correct, any more than believers can definitively prove that ghosts are responsible for what witnesses report experiencing. The stone walls rise thick and gray from the Danish landscape, standing as they have stood for 8 centuries, surviving wars and surviving reformations, and surviving the transformation from fortress to prison to luxury hotel, with the walls containing stories and containing memories of everyone who lived here, and everyone who died here, and everyone who suffered here. When Dragsholm was a place of power and a place of punishment rather than being a destination for tourists seeking history and seeking ghosts and seeking experiences that connect them to Denmark's medieval past. The truth about whether over 100 ghosts haunt these corridors will never be established through investigation or through testimony, because the nature of ghost claims is that they resist proof in either direction, with believers finding confirmation in every sound and every shadow, while skeptics find conventional explanations for the same stimuli, creating a permanent divide between those who experience Dragsholm as haunted and those who experience it as simply being an old building that makes sounds and that contains stories that people tell, without those stories necessarily corresponding to spirits actually remaining after death and actually manifesting in ways that living observers can perceive. The stories persist, regardless of truth, with new generations of visitors coming to Dragsholm, seeking encounters with the White Lady and with the Grey Lady, and with the Earl of Bothwell, whose spirit allegedly rides endlessly through courtyards, replaying tragedy and replaying imprisonment that ended in death, far from Scotland and far from the power struggles that had defined his life, before his capture brought him to a Danish fortress, where he would die and where, according to legend, he would remain trapped in death as he had been trapped in life by walls too thick to escape and by circumstances too powerful to overcome, even for a man who had been earl and who had been consort to a queen before everything fell apart and before his story ended in a dungeon at Dragsholm, where the walls still stand and where the stories still circulate and where visitors still come seeking truth or seeking thrills, in a place where 8 centuries of history have created layers of meaning and layers of legend that make distinguishing between what happened and what people claim happened impossible, when evidence fades and when stories remain and when the castle survives. Because people want to believe that some places hold on to the past and hold on to the dead in ways that make history present and that make the boundaries between then and now permeable enough that spirits might cross back if spirits exist at all, which is a question that Dragsholm raises but that Dragsholm cannot answer. Despite centuries of ghost stories and despite testimony from countless visitors who leave convinced they encountered something beyond normal experience in rooms where nobles were imprisoned, and in dungeons where Bothwell died, and in corridors where the White Lady allegedly wanders eternally searching for the love and the life that imprisonment stole, and that death has not released her from, if the stories are true, and if death does not end everything, and if some consciousness persists, bound to locations where suffering occurred and where injustice occurred, creating hauntings that are not supernatural but are simply the past, refusing to stay buried in history books or in archives, but instead remaining present for those willing to believe that old stones remember and that old walls contain more than just the silence of empty rooms waiting for the next tour group or the next overnight guest who will sleep where prisoners slept and who will walk where ghosts allegedly walk, and who will decide for themselves whether Dragsholm is haunted or whether Dragsholm is simply old and atmospheric and filled with stories that people want to believe, because belief transforms tourism into adventure, and because believing in ghosts means believing that death is not the end, and that some part of us persists beyond the grave, even if that persistence is tragic and is imprisonment in death, as Bothwell and the White Lady are allegedly imprisoned at Dragsholm, repeating their suffering eternally, or until whatever binds them finally releases them to whatever comes after, if anything comes after. Which is the question that haunted castles ask, and that haunted castles cannot answer, but that draws people seeking answers, or seeking experiences that ordinary life cannot provide, when the desire for meaning and the desire for connection with something beyond the material world brings visitors to Dragsholm, where they can sleep in medieval rooms and can eat gourmet meals and can walk corridors, where 800 years of Danish history occurred, and where ghosts might or might not walk, depending on what you believe and depending on what you experience. When darkness falls and when old buildings creak and when imagination and suggestion and the power of place combine to create experiences that feel real, regardless of what skeptics say, and regardless of what conventional explanations might account for sounds and sights that visitors interpret as ghosts when those visitors want to encounter ghosts, and when those visitors have paid for the privilege of spending nights in Denmark's most haunted castle, where belief and business and history have become inseparable, and where distinguishing between genuine paranormal activity and clever marketing becomes impossible, when both serve the same purpose of keeping people interested and keeping people visiting and keeping the stories alive across generations, who discover Dragsholm and who add their own experiences to the accumulated testimony that makes the castle's haunted reputation self-sustaining and self-reinforcing, regardless of whether objective investigation would support the claims or would reveal that everything has natural explanations that disappoint believers, but that satisfy skeptics in an eternal debate, that places like Dragsholm ensure will never be resolved, because unresolved mysteries attract more attention than solved ones, and because ambiguity allows everyone to find what they seek, whether that is confirmation that ghosts exist or confirmation that they do not exist, with Dragsholm providing evidence for both positions depending on how you interpret what you experience when walking through a castle that has stood for 8 centuries, and that will likely stand for centuries more, collecting new stories and collecting new witnesses and remaining a place where history and legend have merged so completely that separating them would require destroying both and would require eliminating what makes Dragsholm distinctive and what makes it worth preserving not just as architecture, but as a repository of stories that Denmark tells about itself and about its past, and about the persistence of memory in places where significant events occurred and where significant suffering occurred, creating locations that feel different from ordinary spaces. Even if that difference exists only in our minds and in our cultural awareness, that transforms ordinary stones into haunted castles through the power of storytelling and through the human need for places that connect us to our history and that connect us to questions about mortality and about consciousness and about whether anything of us remains after death ends the life we knew. If old castles and unresolved mysteries fascinate you, if places where documented history and persistent legend become impossible to separate interest you, subscribe for more stories from Europe's medieval fortresses, where 800 years of occupation inevitably produces deaths and produces stories and produces claims that the dead remain in forms that the living sometimes perceive, or sometimes imagine we perceive, when visiting locations that culture has marked as haunted, and that tourism has marketed as destinations for those seeking encounters with whatever lingers in places where violence and suffering and imprisonment occurred during centuries when power meant controlling fortresses, and when disagreeing with kings could mean spending your final years in dungeons beneath castles, like Dragsholm, where the walls still stand and where the stories still circulate and where visitors still come seeking connections with Denmark's medieval past and seeking experiences that transcend ordinary tourism by offering possibilities of encountering the paranormal in settings where history makes ghost stories plausible, even if proof remains forever elusive and forever disputed between those who believe and those who doubt in an endless conversation that ensures places like Dragsholm will never be forgotten and will never be dismissed as merely old buildings, but will remain as locations where something indefinable exists that draws people and that makes them wonder whether the dead truly rest or whether some part of what we were persists in places we inhabited and in places we suffered, creating hauntings that are real to those who experience them, regardless of whether skeptics can explain away every report through conventional causes that might account for phenomena without requiring ghosts to exist at all.